Hey everybody, and welcome. My name is Ed Kabashik Jr. I serve as the current president of the Springfield Public Forum's Board of Directors. Tonight, it's my pleasure to kick off our fall 2020 speaker series virtually with best-selling authors Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn joining us to talk about their book, Tightrope: Americans Reaching for Hope. Please note that the raise hand and chat functions will not be available for tonight's talk, but we will be accepting questions via the Q&A button. This is an important part of what we do when we're live, and I encourage everybody to submit questions. Questions will be reviewed and sent to the moderator, but not all questions will be able to be answered in the 1-hour window we have for tonight's discussion. Tonight's program is made possible through the generosity of Mass Humanities. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Brian Boyles, the Executive Director of Mass Humanities.
Thanks so much, Ed, and I want to thank the Springfield Public Forum and Michelle Marash for having Mass Humanities be a part of what I think will be a very special evening about a very moving book with two really powerful voices. Tonight, we're speaking with Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn. They've co-authored several books, including A Path Appears and Half the Sky. Together, they were awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1990 for their coverage of China, and they also received the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Lifetime Achievement in 2009. Nick is now an op-ed columnist at the Times. He was previously the bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo, and he won his second Pulitzer in 2006 for his columns on Darfur. And Sheryl worked at the New York Times as a business editor and foreign correspondent in Tokyo and Beijing, and now works in banking. Nick, Sheryl, welcome to the forum.
Thank you so much. We're delighted to join you.
So we're talking to you about Tightrope today. It is a book that really focuses on Nick's hometown of Yamhill, and we were talking earlier tonight, that's where you all are tonight, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. If you hear a dog barking in the background or, a tractor making noises, that's because here we are on the family farm where I grew up.
Wonderful. Well, before we get started, I did want to ask, how have the fires that have been ravaging Oregon and the West Coast, how have they impacted Yamhill?
Well, actually, they came within 5 miles of the farm, so we were very, very lucky. And also, we're also very lucky now that the recent rains have just basically doused out most of the fire. So we think that at least most of us are in good shape, except for, of course, the towns that were just, basically blazed through. Talent in Phoenix, and those are really sad places right now. And so our hearts go out to those people.
What I would just add, though, is that what I find really dispiriting is that the evidence is so overwhelming that these fires here in Oregon were a consequence of climate change. And yet so many people, including my dear friends and neighbors, have concluded that these are the result of Antifa or Black Lives Matter arsonists going around setting fires. And there's this hysteria. You had people setting up armed checkpoints to look for Antifa arsonists. And, I encountered plenty of militia checkpoints in Sudan or Yemen. I don't expect them to find them in a state that I dearly love.
That's painful to hear, and to think that we really should be having a great checkpoint established for climate change, and unfortunately people are still seeming to avoid that point.
Exactly.
So I wanted to start tonight, because I am with Mass Humanities, with a more humanities-based question before we get into the issues. And as we were talking before we got on here tonight, Mass Humanities supports a project called the Clemente Course in the Humanities in 5 different cities around Massachusetts, including right here in Springfield. And this summer, we hosted writing courses, and these are for adults, most of them who face many of the challenges that the residents of Yamhill face. And they wrote op-eds, they read Nick's work, they're also going to receive a copy of your book. And as I was thinking about them tonight, I thought, well, every aspiring writer looks to great writers, and really starts to help find their voice through reading other people. And I wanted to step back, I think, for a second, and because we all admire your work, both of you so much, just ask, early on, as you were thinking of pursuing a life as a writer, who were the writers, maybe just one, that you really looked to as a role model, as an inspiration?
In my case, there was when I was a university student, there was a writer for The Guardian named Victor Zorza, who I've never met him, but he had, I think, covered the Kremlin for years. And then I think he thought he had cancer and went off to India and began reporting from a single village, using that as a microcosm to tell a much larger story. And to me, reading those weekly essays was a reminder of the power of the microcosm and storytelling to tell a larger important point.
I have actually a number of my former colleagues at the New York Times who I used to aspire to write like. Ed Gargan was one of my favorite writers in China. He used to write some wonderful stories about little villages in China. And then John Burns was also in China and wrote some terrific stories. And one I will never forget about cannibalism in China. So that always stuck out with me when he went to Yunnan province and he, opened his story with the lead about how, someone, found a skeleton of a brain or whatever was left of a head, and then it went on from there.
Well, tonight we're talking about Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. It's a book that came out this year. Tightrope to me represents this balancing act that Americans need to face, especially working class Americans, just to survive in this country. But it also seems to reflect the structure of the book in many ways. You balance between, I think, big macroeconomic trends, great analysis of data, as well as reports that have come out through other folks, and these small, intimate portraits. And, relevant to what we were just saying, I always think about William Faulkner's quote that I discovered that my own little postage stamp of native soil was worth writing about, and that I would never live long enough to exhaust it. In this book, you really take a look at Nick's classmates and the people that he knows from around Yam Hill. It feels to me like this is a book that's probably been coming for a while. Both the analysis that you put on the macro level, but also, looking at the people that you've grown up with. Can you talk a little bit about the history of this book in particular and why it came about now?
Sheryl and I were traveling around the world covering humanitarian crises, and we gradually saw that there was a humanitarian crisis right here at home among people that I grew up with, who I dearly loved. And the family that got on the bus right after I did each morning were the Knapp family. Farland was my grade. His younger brother Zealand, his brother Nathan, their sister Regina, and the baby brother Keelan. And they, like so many people on my bus, they lived much better lives. Their dad had a good job, union job laying pipe. And then all of the kids went through troubles as jobs began to move away. Farland then self-medicated with alcohol and drugs and died of liver failure as a consequence. Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Regina died of hepatitis from injecting drugs. And Keelan, just in March, after COVID hit, he died of a heroin overdose. And, I think about these 5 happy kids looking forward to a better life, and their mom is still alive, and thinking that if I had grown up in their house and Farland had grown up in my house, then our fates would have been reversed. And we as taxpayers spent so much money incarcerating the Knapps and nothing to try to educate them, support them, train and provide job training, provide help with addictions. And and then we gradually saw that the problems, on a quarter of the kids on my old school bus have died from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And then we saw this isn't a problem of one bus or one town, but a national problem all across the country and in working class communities, white, black, brown. And that is when we decided, we've got to do this. It's a much more sort of painful book to write when you're writing about people you know and love than when you're going to a refugee camp somewhere halfway around the world. But this one was from the heart.
Yeah. What was it like approaching your friends and your former busmates and telling them that this was part of a story you were trying to tell?
They were remarkably willing to participate. We used their real names, and one of our very good friends, Clayton Green, who Clayton had he had cooked meth for a while, and he sold meth and used meth, and at first he didn't want that part in the book, and we said, Clayton, that's just a part of who you are, that's a part of your story, and he agreed, and he trusted us to tell that part of it, and that felt like a special burden on us to get it right. And frankly, we were a little nervous that we would write about these things and then confirm outsiders' prejudices about folks who were less educated. And, Clayton was a 400-pound guy who had a criminal record, and people could look at the pictures of Clayton in the book and, maybe conjure all kinds of mental constructs that would just add to this communications gap across America. And so we really wanted to get it right, not pull punches, but be blunt and explain also that here's a smart, loyal friend who, in a different circumstance, could have done so much more and contributed so much more to the country. And we were a little nervous when the book came out, but it was welcomed by people. I don't think they don't want your sympathy. They want understanding. They want respect and dignity.
There are two things that I think were very interesting to us. One is that a lot of the people we talked to in Yamhill, they were actually really interested in talking about their lives. I mean, I think it was partly because no one has ever been interested in their lives before. No one has shown an interest in trying to talk about their lives and report about their lives to the rest of the country, which to them, it made them feel, oh, I'm actually important enough that someone wants to tell my story. So that was really interesting, and especially with Keelan, for instance, he was planning to actually join us on a panel discussion so that he could tell his story. He said, it's my family story, I want to tell it. And we were really excited to sit alongside a panel with them, but of course COVID changed all that, and then him passing away changed that as well. The second thing that we also found is that it's happening in towns across the country. I mean, we thought, oh goodness, this is really unusual, and maybe it's just Yamhill, maybe it's just this area of rural Oregon. But then we started to go to other places across the country, and we discovered, no, this is happening in places that you'd never think about going to, in different kinds of communities, not just lily white rural Oregon, but also in bigger cities, inner cities, but also in other rural parts of Arkansas, for instance. That is basically Black America. I mean, it's amazing the similarities that have befallen a lot of these people, and we aren't talking about it. This isn't part of the national conversation as much as it should be. I think COVID has changed a little bit of that, but it really should be more of the national conversation.
Agreed. When I saw the picture of Clayton Green, he reminded me of my mom's cousin, who I referred to as an uncle, who lived in the basement in the house across the street, came to a similar end. And I think the way that you treat people with the grace that you do and allowing their story to come out is very crucial, because there's no way to sort of otherize that person. There's very much, yep, I have a cousin, I have a brother, I have a sister. But what you also do that I think is super important is you show why there are these macro forces that have come to be brought to bear on someone like Clayton. And I'm particularly interested in your analysis of the way that addiction and substance abuse in this country, which is so prevalent, and I think to Sheryl's point, is really not talked about in an honest way, was very much tied to a business model that was driven by manufacturers like Pfizer. Can you talk a little bit just about that dynamic and how you look at really what is $1 billion industry, and then how that filters down to now create what you've really shown is an intergenerational problem we're facing?
Yeah. So, addiction in this country was driven more. I mean, the big drug lords weren't in Colombia; they were in American pharma companies, and in the 1990s. They wanted to find new big hit billion-dollar drugs. And so they decided that opioids would be it. They developed research to purportedly show these are not addictive. And then they emphasized the idea that doctors are under-medicating pain, which perhaps had a grain of truth to it. And so the fifth vital sign became pain, and then they were paying kickbacks to doctors, et cetera. And so one reason why 70,000 Americans die each year from overdoses is because industry was underregulated in ways that preyed upon some of the most vulnerable people. And that's a huge, we talk about this as an issue of personal responsibility. It's also an issue of collective responsibility. And Clayton screwed up, but so did we. And, another factor in this is that people self-medicate for a reason. And governments in the US, federal and state, failed working class Americans in a way that was not true in Canada and Europe, because people were more in need of that kind of self-medication.
But I think it's also important to recognize that in other countries like Canada and also in Europe, they do regulate opioids much more strictly than we do here in the US. And so while in the US, we sort of take pride in having a free market, and we historically have been very forgiving towards big pharma, I think that it is really important that we make sure that the FDA still looks at the science and not get politicized the way it is being politicized now in the pandemic, because we have seen what happens when there is not necessarily politicization, but there is a wink wink and a nod nod, which is what we had when Purdue Pharma, for instance, was leading the way in trying to get pain as the fifth sign, vital sign, and to actually create a new time capsule, special time release, so that it could take this for a longer period of time, and it's time released, when in fact it was the exact same product as the previous one. It just wanted to extend its patent. So there are a lot of things that science actually just didn't really rigorously analyze. And when we just sort of slip up in that kind of situation, this is what can be just run through that big loophole. And so I think it's really important for us to stick really to the science, and also, not be bullied really by lobbying that really does take effect, in Washington, which is what helped the pharmaceutical companies, who then jumped on the bandwagon when it came to opioids, to continue selling to opioids for the next 20 years. I mean, this went on for many, many years. About 80% of people who are addicted to heroin got their first start with prescription opioids. So this is not, this is not a small portion of the addicted people who have addiction. Now they've actually clamped down, and some people say, oh, they've clamped down too much. I think that erring on that side is a little bit probably safer than being too loose. But we do need to pay much more attention to the people who are actually, who are afflicted with these issues.
I like this idea of collective responsibility, because your book really talks about how self-responsibility and the bootstraps have been really politicized to just cast blame on people. And I think what I'm hearing from you, Sheryl, is solutions could include more science when it comes to the pharmaceutical products that are put out there. But I would also like to say, let's look here a little bit more at what the solutions could be, because we know there are so many individual lives impacted. So when it comes to how we might get out and think of our group collective commitment to each other to end, or to at least stem the tide of addiction, what are other ways that you see could be done, especially on a local level, I think, to really help people out of what is now just a vice?
Well, I think there are several things that we saw. First of all, we think that it's really important for a community to be careful with people who are laid off. I mean, I think that starts when you don't have your job. That's kind of the trigger that actually, forces people to think, oh, there's, woe is me, there's something wrong with me. I mean, they need help. It's not like they need everything, given to them on a silver platter. They just need a little nudge. They need a little help. And let me just give you a quick example of the kind of thing that I mean. So if you look at what happened after the 2008 financial crisis, when the auto workers laid off a lot of people. So we had a very interesting comparison between what happened in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, where there were some, American auto worker factories, and what happened in Detroit. People got laid off in both cities. In the US, they got this huge unemployment because we stepped it up because of the unusual nature of the financial crisis. But you lost your job, you lost your health care, right? Over in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, you lost your job, but you had your health care still because they have nationalized health care. And so here in the US, you just had to look for your job yourself. You just were, going online, or you were just going to employment offices. In Windsor, Ontario, Canada, the government kicks in, and it actually started looking for industries that could, employ a large group of people who had just been laid off in the auto industry. And they saw that there was a real big need in the local area for nursing. So they helped facilitate training programs that would allow some of these auto workers, I'm sure they weren't really thrilled, but it was a potential job opportunity to get trained in something else like nursing. And so at least these people were ushered back into the workforce more quickly. And so they didn't have not only the financial burden, but also just the psychological burden, which is what happened in Detroit. And you saw just like years of just this devastation. And then that leads to self-medication. So then when you get someone who is self-medicating and then who is getting addicted, often if they become homeless and then they commit a crime to, they want to steal something to get some money, they get thrown in jail, all right? And we saw this so many times. They get thrown in jail, but jail really isn't the best place for them, right? What they really need is rehabilitation. And so there's some great programs. There's actually one in McMinnville, Oregon, nearby here. And we also saw one in Oklahoma that focused on women who have addictions. These people say, okay, let's divert these people from jail. They work with the Attorney General's office, they work with the courts, they work with the jails. And they say, if these people, if their underlying pathology is really due to an addiction, let's actually treat that. And so like this program in Oklahoma, which is terrific, Tulsa, they basically take these women and they put them into this like basically year and a half or 2-year program where they basically put them through rehabilitation, intense psychotherapy. They give them medical treatment. They basically try to wean them off drugs, and then they start giving them business skills, job skills. And they teach them, basically you're actually retraining so many parts of their lives. And if they have kids, how to have, parenting skills that they've never learned because they didn't go to any parenting classes. So this is the kind of program, that they put these women through. And then 1 or 2 years later, they come out and they have often gone through an apprenticeship with a local employer. They come out with a job and they become a productive member of society. And as a result, they save so much money for the local community because that money's not going to a jail, the jail system every year to put them in a place that isn't going to rehabilitate them. So it's it's a win-win all around. So these are the types of programs that really need to be replicated across the country.
I really remember, I think it was maybe the Tulsa DA that you talked to, someone in Tulsa said, what we're doing isn't working. And that comparison between the American and Canadian responses to the collapse of the auto industry after the financial crisis also really, really sticks out. And for me, there's a cruelty that has really been inflicted and instilled into the way both governments and corporations look at the underserved, whether it's exploitation through the opioid crisis or really exploitation, as you describe it, through mass incarceration. You travel to Baltimore, you talk to Daniel McDowell, who's a veteran and Baltimore resident who's been in jail, he's been homeless and addicted, and this really stuck out to me. You wrote, a couple of generations ago, the United States rewarded veterans by affording them education and housing benefits. More recently, the United States helped get veterans hooked on drugs and then incarcerated them. It's a very harsh, but very real statement about the condition of this country. I wonder if we could walk back and talk a little bit about what at the political level had changed. And I think you really take it back about 40 years, that the orientation of government has not just been to not have a safety net, but to actually in some places almost be predatory. against people in need. What's the arc there that leads us to where we are today?
I think you're right that there's a gratuitous cruelty often in our policies. And I think that it goes back in part to 1968 and the Nixon Southern strategy and a racialization of policies and a argument that essentially if you invest in human capital, if you invest in social services, then the other African Americans will disproportionately benefit. They will exploit the system. And we were willing to inflict really harsh measures, including mass incarceration, one of the great tragedies of this country's policies, because it was perceived that African Americans were going to be the targets of that. And I think that was accompanied at the same time by a change in the narrative in which it was all about personal responsibility and lift yourselves up by the bootstraps, as he said. And the irony is that expression of lift yourself up by the bootstraps, in the 19th century, it meant exactly the opposite. It meant it was a term used to mock something that was impossible. And then suddenly in the 20th century, it became instructions for poor people to do this. And I think that narrative, that's one of the reasons we wrote Tightrope, because we wanted to challenge this narrative, which seems to us at the root of so much that is wrong in American policymaking for the last 50 years. And it's, you can't, look, people do dumb things. They make bad choices. They show a lack of responsibility. I don't want to take away anybody's agency, but when you can make a prediction about a newborn infant that, in 3 counties in the United States, that newborn infant will have a shorter life expectancy than a baby born in Cambodia or Bangladesh, that's not because that infant is making bad choices. That's because we as a society are making bad choices about healthcare, about so much more. And look, in the context of driving, we understand that people show a lack of responsibility and that's a cause of traffic accidents. They text while they drive, they drive too fast, they scold their kids in the back seat when they're driving, they drink and they drive. And yet we don't, we could put spikes in dashboards to really teach them a lesson, to show them the importance of personal responsibility. And yet, of course, instead, we have seatbelts and airbags and divided highways and lit roads, and we take a million steps to try to mitigate the consequences of irresponsible behavior. And yet somehow, in the context of the working class, black and white, no, we do the functional equivalent of putting spikes in dashboards.
Well, another example, for instance, even right now, and I know people are going to look at it with a different lens as well, but if you look at the argument over why we should give $600 a week, in sort of unemployment or stimulus payments, and that being more than what a lot of people, make in a week, so that will just prevent them or keep them home. Why should they go work for less? A lot of studies have shown that actually it's only on the margin that people are taking that extra money, because in the long term, they want to keep their job and they know that this, money is only going to be short term, and so people who really need it are the ones who are going to get it, not people who already have a job and they'll quit because they know it's only going to be a few months and they won't have a job when, on the other end. But at the same time, what people don't realize is that meanwhile, in the big, $1 trillion package, there were hundreds of millions of loans, corporate welfare to real estate, barons who really, could survive on their own without that money. But how come they're not looked upon as, they also, if you give them this, this money, then they're not going to work as hard, to fix that, program, or to cut costs in the real estate deal that they're doing. Why are we helping those people and not people who really are kind of at the edge of poverty? It's, I think, partly because we often otherize people who are in poverty, and we don't otherize someone who is well educated, who is, doing real estate deals and who just needs a little bit more money to boost his returns. And so I think that the otherizing may be what's going on, and especially with this personal narrative.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think this pandemic is showing just the absurd void there is between us having any kind of solidarity around these issues and really seeing, if we were ever going to be in the same boat, this is it, and instead there's infighting while those loans are being passed and approved. A lot of the last few months, we've really had a national conversation around race and systemic racism. And in some ways, the book looks almost at a systemic classism, at this fundamental inequality that is built into our economic system. With racism, we have flashpoints. We have instances of police brutality. We have the murders of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor. And we then can protest, we can build solidarity, we can advocate for against police brutality. But when it comes to the issue that we're talking about economic inequality, where are the flashpoints? And where is the call for that kind of reform? Maybe even the more narrow reform of a particular aspect of this economy, but where do you see people really getting it? You know, that just as I think a lot more Americans over the last few months have gotten the fact that racism has done something so fundamentally horrible to African Americans, there seems to be a deeper thing going on with the economy and with that inequality that people can't wrap their heads around or point to an instant or a flashpoint and say, yep, that's a sign that this is just wrong the way we're set up.
Yeah, I think that progressives, at least in America, have begun to wake up to the degree of institutional racism across the country in every feature of life, from housing discrimination to law enforcement discrimination to educational discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think people have woken up to the degree to class disadvantage. They understand racial privilege, but perhaps not class privilege. And they, of course, often intersect with race. And so, you know, those at the bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum are disproportionately both African American and from lower SES. But I don't think that we really respond to that. And I think one unfortunate reason is that the best escalator out of these circumstances is education. And those who have made it in America, frankly, have a stake in an educational system in America that advantages those who are well off and their children and disadvantages those who are poor. And local funding of schools is a system to advantage the advantaged and to harm the disadvantaged. And it often works against African Americans. It also works against those with class disadvantage.
What I enjoy so much, or at least appreciate so much about the book, is how much of it is local. We know that Americans are completely at this point consumed by national politics. And we also know that most Americans are aware that what happens in Washington does not impact their lives as much as what happens at the State House. We didn't hear a lot, I think, in the book about who the mayor of Yamhill is, what the town council looks like. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the relationship between local residents and local politics are? Because if I have any hope, it is that there's an opportunity for people to take the controls of government at that level and maybe actually make some change in their immediate lives.
So because most of the area is rural, so it's kind of in the hands of county commissioners more than of like the mayor of Yamhill. And in general, the working class in places like Yamhill tends to be socially conservative, but more economically liberal. And I think that, so as a result, Yamhill County actually has some pretty good programs on issues like helping with addiction or helping with health care for those who lack it, this kind of thing. But people tend to be more conservative on the social issues. And that's one thing that actually gives me a certain amount of hope. We've been pouring on all these bleak narratives, but it's often thought that the white working class is sort of fundamentally conservative. And I don't think that's exactly right. The black working class and the white working class are both socially conservative, but economically liberal. And so if the issue is abortion or same-sex marriage, then they are more likely to vote conservative. If the issue is minimum wage, healthcare, then they're more likely to vote liberal. And African-American workers go to the voting booth and they vote Democratic because issues of racial justice trump those social issues. The white working class, since the time of Reagan, has gone to the voting booth and disproportionately voted Republican because issues of guns, gays, God, the three Gs, have trumped the economic issues. You know, at this moment, when there are 11.5 million fewer people employed than there were in February, the economic crisis in places like Yam Hill is just manifest. People are struggling, and they don't entirely know whether to blame this on President Trump, their disagreement about that, but they are hurting. And I think that economic issues may, as a result, disproportionately affect the way they vote in November.
But I must say, though, that a lot of them, partly because of their background, they aren't as familiar with the way the politics works. So, for instance, they can see that they get healthcare. Clayton, actually, towards the end of his life, got healthcare because of the Medicaid expansion in Oregon. Oregon is part of that. It's one of the states that took Medicaid expansion. But they don't necessarily see that as a byproduct of Obamacare. For them, it's just, this is the state and this is it. And they don't make the connection that it might be more of a Democratic thing versus a Republican thing. And then at the same time, they may be trained on Fox News. And so they're only hearing things that come out of Fox News. And so I am not sure how much they totally understand that this is an economically liberal issue that may be, encouraged and, proposed by the Democrats versus the Republicans. So I think it's, for a lot of people, it's very kind of, nebulous, and they kind of think this is the team that I'm on, and I'm just on this team. So for instance, one of Clayton's brothers, well, he knew that obviously Clayton was getting the healthcare, and the healthcare, maybe he didn't know that was a Obamacare, spin-off or whatever. And so he's going to vote for Trump. I mean, it's that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily track for them practically. And maybe it's just more of, I root for my team, and they don't see the direct benefit because they don't make all those connections. So it doesn't matter as much. It's more of a personality contest. And if they love the way Trump sort of, is an iconoclast, then that's what they'll do. They'll vote for him.
It seems like a lot of the political climate is about discarding that collective good, and to say that I don't want to be responsible for any other person. And I therefore admire a government that approaches things that way, which is a fairly nihilistic way to approach life and politics, I think. We talked a little bit at the beginning about climate. But when you look at, and it's very hard to look ahead right now, but when you look at a post-pandemic America, and really a post-pandemic Yam Hill County, what do you see taking shape? Because it does feel like we're going to emerge as a changed country from this. The economy, it's very hard to see what it's, how it will track back to a place that we would even be familiar with. What are the things that would need to happen to help Yam Hill County actually have a better future coming out of this pandemic versus how it entered?
So let me offer, again, a ray of hope here. History often, I think, works in cycles. Arthur Schlesinger made that argument years ago. And it seems to me that since the mid-1970s, we've been in this cycle where it's been all about cutting taxes and cutting investments in human capital with disastrous results. And this has happened under Democrats and Republicans alike. It's the reason that we are the only advanced country in the world that doesn't have universal health care, doesn't have universal paid sick leave, et cetera, et cetera. And yet I wonder if even before COVID-19, that narrative and that cycle wasn't beginning to change. And I wonder if in retrospect, people may not look back at Kansas under Governor Sam Brownback, which, as you remember, slashed taxes and then slashed school spending as a turning point. And Kansas Republicans rebelled against that experiment and said, tax us more. I wonder if that may not be seen as a turning point. Then elected a Democratic governor. Likewise, you had red states like Utah and Idaho that expanded Medicaid. You had Texas that helped lead the way back from mass incarceration. And it's also, I think, true that COVID-19 has made more clear the costs of this kind of nihilistic behavior, so that in a time of chronic disease, we may not think much about those who don't have access to healthcare, who don't have paid sick leave. But in a time of infectious disease, those people who don't get healthcare, who don't get paid sick leave, they threaten everyone else. And it's more clear that we have a shared interest in healthcare. And likewise, I think you can make an argument that just as in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected with this huge mandate. He flipped the Senate, I think, for the first time since 1918, precisely because Herbert Hoover's policies had failed so abjectly. Well, it sure seems to me that existing policies have failed particularly abjectly in the last 3.5 years. And I don't want to be Panglossian about it. I don't know that this will happen, but I think there is at least an opportunity to begin to address some long-term corrective actions to fix what seems to me to be 50 years of failed policy.
Well, I also think, however, I just want to have a note of caution, because I do think that, some of the Democratic platform isn't focused enough on economics, and jobs. And there are people in red country who basically are blaming the Democrats for the lockdowns. In areas that didn't get COVID really badly, like for instance, this is an area where COVID did not strike very badly. People are just basically saying, oh, well, is it real? Is it for real? I mean, is COVID for real? They weren't struck with the fear of getting COVID the way in the Northeast. We were just absolutely terrified by it. And here it's more, why on earth are you shutting down the economy for something that really is not that prevalent here in Oregon? And so they see the after effects of that shutdown and their economic livelihood sort of at stake or threatened. And they think that that's a problem of the Democrats, because all the Democrats want to do is spend money and take my taxes and spend it on someone else, rather than either on fixing the road right in front of my house or something that will help me. So I do think that attitude is still prevalent, and I don't want to underplay it. I do think we have to be very cognizant that there are people who still think that way.
Sure. And at the time of Hoover and FDR, they were just learning how to use radio effectively. We, of course, have a 24/7 news cycle and social media and Russian bots affecting how people see their world. If this was a different, and I have to say a better time, we would be together in Symphony Hall in Springfield, and there would be a line of people ready to ask questions. So I want to encourage people to put their questions into the chat. Several have been sent to me, so I'm going to pitch a couple to you all and continue this conversation. What can we do to improve public education? Too many areas in the country don't have good schools, which impacts the opportunities for higher ed and even job training.
So it was striking to me that in the Democratic primaries, there was a lot of talk about improving college access, and that's important and necessary and so on. But we don't talk enough about the fact that 1 in 7 Americans still doesn't graduate from high school. And those people are cooked. In 2020, if you don't graduate from high school, then you and your kids are really sentenced to a second-class existence. And so, the first thing we need to do is early childhood interventions, and that's national pre-K, which is also hugely important for childcare, but also interventions in the first 3 years of 0 to 3 space for disadvantaged kids in particular. And then beyond that, a big focus on getting that high school graduation rate up. In America, we invented the mass high school, and yet so many countries have surpassed us. We can do better on vocational education, as so many other countries do. And then, then we need to layer college access on top of that. But there's an awful lot we can do early on, and that that maybe the highest return investment available in America is not with a hedge fund, it's not with private equity, it's early childhood for disadvantaged kids.
And if we're talking about just having a collective responsibility, or something that gives us an incentive to actually want to become part of a larger body, which is the country, I think it's important to recognize that the US, on several metrics, including one called the Social Progress Index, it is really falling behind. I mean, it used to be at the top of, almost every metric, right? The US was number one in this, number one in that, number one in education, number one in innovation. We're still good at innovation. But if you look at very basic needs and how the country fills those needs, internet access or, clean water, talk about climate change, clean water, education, we are like we're number 46, 41. We're way behind other countries on a scale of 186 countries. Come on. Why aren't we in the top 10? There are so few areas where we are in the top 10, and we are actually one of the one or two or three countries that is actually continuing to fall behind where we were the previous year. So do you want to be part of a country that is falling behind in the metrics, or do you want to be one that's really out in front? If we want to compete with China, with India, that means every person in the country needs a high school education, needs to go to college, because we need every working human being to reach their full potential so that we can compete with a country that has 1 billion poor people, or a country that's soon to have 1 billion poor people. Right now, if we don't help our fellow Americans, we're not going to be able to compete with China or India in the future.
This actually is a thought that I had when I was reading the book, because you both are global in your reporting and in your experiences, and I think how you frame this problem. These forces, many of them, are ones that have to do with globalization. Are there other places in the world, we've talked about places where they've done it better, but are there places where these dynamics are having a similar effect, whether it is mass incarceration or addiction or education and human and quality of life impact, or is America really exceptional in this?
Well, both are true. So, look, globalization and mechanization have been challenges for the working class all over the world. And so you see inequality increasing in Europe, in Australia, in Canada. And yet you haven't had the kind of disintegration of the social fabric that you've had in the US. You don't see that in other countries. And I think that's partly because other countries were much more likely to invest in human capital, whether education or healthcare, and to build more equitable structures so that the schooling, education, for example, is much more equal from one school to another in Canada than it is in the US. And so the consequence, and likewise, other countries didn't develop this narrative in which we blame people for their economic failures and see it as a moral failing as well. And so the upshot was that, all over the world, societies are wrestling with loneliness, with social isolation, with narcotics, but nobody on the scale of the United States. Mm-hmm. And again, that's partly a function of policies that Portugal and the US were both wrestling in the 1990s with heroin problems. And the US doubled down on a law enforcement model and throw people in jail and, toss away the key. Portugal instead decriminalized drug possession, even of hard drugs, and used a public health model, provide treatment to people. So as a result, Portugal has seen its number of heroin users decline by 2/3 and has the lowest rate of heroin overdoses in Western Europe. Meanwhile, the US loses 70,000 Americans a year to overdoses. So we have compounded our problems with really myopic policies, I think.
It's a question from Ashanta Smith. Do you think that Black Lives Matter is addressing a lot of the issues you wrote about, maybe in different ways? Is this not just about justice for Black people, but I guess her question being it's much broader than that. How does Black Lives Matter as a movement, do you feel, intersect with the issues that you're highlighting in Tightrope?
So, I mean, some of the most profound inequities in America are education, for example. The idea that, the education race gap, for example, can be addressed by giving access to better schools. And yet American schools have become more segregated in America since, I think, 1997. I forget the number of kids, but there are a significant number of African-American kids who go to what are called apartheid schools, where 99% of the kids are kids of color. And so I think it is important to see racial inequity not only through the prism of what law enforcement does, although clearly that's important, but also through the context of access to education in particular, to enrichment programs for children, to healthcare, et cetera. And it's not, and I should say that, you know, Native American kids are some of the most disadvantaged in this country. And I mentioned that there were 3 counties where life expectancy is shorter than in Cambodia or Bangladesh. 2 of those are Native American counties. And so, you know, Bureau of Indian Education schools in America have a high school graduation rate of 53%. That's unconscionable.
The thing is, we know these zip codes. We know where these neighborhoods are that don't have the good schools, but we just ignore that. So for instance, within the same city, you could be 2 miles apart. The zip codes that are 2 miles apart, and the survival rate, just the lifespan, is 20 years difference. You know, 68 versus, you know, 88. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And it's just, we're turning a blind eye because we know what zip codes these are. And they tend to be, and often they may be both Black and, underprivileged in terms of economic, you know, strata. So we know what works to fix it. We just don't appropriate the money. And, you know, the interesting thing is with regard to schools, there is a fund that is supposed to be used to actually help these underprivileged schools or the schools that are not doing so well. But the money never gets dispersed. It's just, you know, insane that, you know, policymakers try to address this by creating a fund that would specifically where the money is used to help these schools, and the money doesn't get dispersed and doesn't get used by these schools that need it.
You know, I lived in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and I remember thinking that the years and years and years of cuts to government funding had no longer made government a place where people who were innovative or action-oriented enough to actually solve that particular problem were in place. You know, that they would just, someone wasn't going to just make sure that funds got spent, but that was a self-fulfilling prophecy of an anti-government equation. We have a question from Jennifer Hall-Witt. Is there a gender dimension to the crisis you describe in the book? And if so, how do you explain it? And I think there's some really important female voices in the book.
There are, although, you know, in many ways, it's something of a contrast from what we had written about before. One of our previous books was Half the Sky, about inequity addressed to women and girls around the world. And in most of the world, the big education gap is that boys are much more likely to go to high school, for example, much more likely to become literate. In the US, in the underclass, there are a lot of disadvantages, especially for people of color, addressed toward boys. So girls in America, 2/3 of the members of the National Honor Society in America are girls. Boys are much less likely to graduate from high school than girls are. They're more likely to self-medicate. Suicide rates are the highest since World War II, and those are disproportionately male suicides. And there also is often a particular stigma attaching themselves to young men, particularly young men of color, but not exclusively, who then kind of drop out of the labor force in ways that damage their futures and damage society as a whole. So it's, you know, there's certainly enormous inequities that attach themselves to women as well, having to do with reproductive healthcare, maternal mortality, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, if you look at life expectancy for boys in troubled areas, it is, there's a particular toll on being born male in some of these zip codes.
You know, and some of the opioid crisis as well really hit men much more hard than it did women. So self-medication, so many of them have to do with men. You know, they got paid off or something like that, that they saw themselves as the breadwinner in the family and they no longer are, so they start self-medicating. that's a real traumatic event for many head of households. And so males were particularly hit hard by the current, hopefully soon to be solved opioid crisis or ongoing opioid crisis. And also a lot of the jobs that are opening up, certainly in healthcare, they are lower paying, they're service. I mean, home health aides, for instance, those are predominantly women. They don't pay nearly as much as other jobs, but women can get jobs doing that. And they will take them. Men are not as inclined to go into nursing as women are. So there are a number of jobs where the growth in those industries is growing, but they're lower paying, and so women tend to take them, whereas the men, are still looking for jobs in their traditional industries.
Actually, Brian, can I just add something that is sort of painful to talk about, but it goes to the complexity of gender relations when the social fabric is falling apart. I mentioned that 2/3 of the kids, that a quarter of the kids on my old school bus had died of drugs, alcohol, suicide. What I didn't mention is that 2 boys on the bus with me later grew up and were sentenced to prison for raping young girls. One of them was a close friend of mine. And, I've written a lot about sexual violence, and I've wondered how that was and how these 2 boys that I knew could have engaged in behavior that I just, I know how this just destroys these kids. And it seems to me that it was in part a function of the disintegration of the social fabric in a community where we had been very proud of the strength of our values and our social fabric. And when that happens, that was obviously devastating for these young men, but as those rapes suggest, it was just incredibly damaging and traumatic for girls as well. And there were too many households in this area where everything just collapsed in ways that, make it hard to talk about, comparisons of who suffered more. It's devastating for everybody.
You all are, I believe, the first couple to ever win a Pulitzer Prize together. And this is a question that I used to ask in before elections that seemed much more secure than the one we're in today. But if the 2 of you were elected in November and took office together,
President, Vice President.
That was exactly what I was going to suggest. What would the first 100 days look like?
Early childhood program, national childcare program, which also has the advantage that it polls very well. It's arguably bipartisan. Bandwidth for all, partly for the same reason, modeled on rural electrification. Drug treatment programs. It is a scandal that in the US, only 20% of Americans with dependency issues are able to get treatment. We're willing to incarcerate people, but not treat them. And there are other tough nuts to crack, including K-12 funding and universal health care that are, that I would certainly love to address, but I think are more difficult politically. But those early childhood programs, drug treatment, and bandwidth for all, I think there is actually some hope that they could actually be passed, even if contested.
I think that one would have to not go on just a listening tour, but I think one would have to have a tour where you're in dialogue with both red and blue. And I think I think the country really needs to heal. It needs to actually come together and not be so divisive. And so if I were a Democrat, then I would go right to red country and talk to people and really meet people in their homes. With COVID, maybe we'll meet in their front yards, just so that we can talk to people who really have never probably talked to a Democrat. And if I were Republican, I would actually go and, talk to, people who are Democrats who probably have never talked to a Republican, president before. I just think that it's really important for people to understand that we're not all that different. And that I think there has to be an effort to have more of a meeting of the minds. And then also every single senator of the other party and every single House of Representative of the other party, so that there isn't this constant divide. I mean, people meet in groups, like, the president meets with all of the House of Representatives of the other party. No, meet them one by one. You need to build up a good relationship with every person. And they may be very stiff in the very beginning, but I think that they have to realize that this nation isn't going to function very well, and it's not going to become number one. I would make that the goal. We want to become number one in all of these areas that are on the Progressive Social Progress Index, because we want to beat, China. We want to beat India. We want everybody getting on the team. We want people to be on the team, and I don't think that people are on the team yet. I think that's really important. And just getting people to understand that the goal is to be number one, so that we can get our economy, humming again, and everybody, working. And it's not going to be a kumbaya moment. This is really to actually come up with concrete, goals to actually get the U.S. back to the number one seat.
You have my vote. At the beginning, this is sort of my last question for the evening, I think. This has just been such a powerful conversation with you, and I appreciate, I think, the frankness and the thought you put into all that you do. At the beginning, I mentioned the writers in our Clemente course in the humanities, and them being people in Worcester and New Bedford and Springfield and the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, who've been trying to give voice to many of the experiences that you talked about for a much more rural community. What you've done so well, as I said in the book, is to treat all humans with grace and to see what has happened as not something that it's a matter of blame, but that we need to do more acknowledgement and pay more attention to that suffering. Are there places where Americans can look where they're going to hear, where you feel like they can hear more of these stories, where they can really get a better sense of what people who are struggling are facing? Because I think that having read your book, many people are going to want to read more, and we want to keep that intention there if we're going to get everybody on the same team. So are there either projects you're working on or other writers or places where you feel like people can turn to stay on, I think, this very humane treatment of the working class?
Well, first, I would say that the documentary for Tightrope is actually coming on in late October on PBS. And it's part of their pre-election coverage, partly because it does illuminate some of the issues that are so prominent right now surfacing in the election.
Yeah, and I wrestle with this question that you raise of how do we highlight these issues more? And I feel some responsibility as a journalist, because I think that frankly, we in journalism have kind of dropped the ball on this sort of suffering. And it always seems to me that we in America develop the worst policy on issues that are hard to talk about, things that are painful, that are taboo. So, domestic violence, for many years, AIDS was a disaster in terms of policy because it was transmitted sexually, and it's uncomfortable to talk about. Homelessness, drugs, all these issues. And I think that that's an area where we in journalism can do a much better job of highlighting these problems and putting a face on them, humanizing them. And I don't think that we adequately do that. I spent a lot of time reporting in Afghanistan and Iraq, and those were important stories. But it strikes me that every 2 weeks, we lose as many Americans from drugs, alcohol, and suicide as we lost in 19 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we didn't cover those deaths as well as we covered the deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan. We dropped the ball. And so how do we try to build these bridges and build understanding? One thing that I've wondered a little bit about is sort of national service programs. Some people would like to make them mandatory. I fear that would just create a lot of resistance. So initially, maybe some kind of a opt-in national service program for young people. And if they participate for a year, then maybe their first 2 years of college are paid for. I'm not quite sure the mechanics of it, but something that would get people out of their orbit, as the military does, provide a measure of discipline, expose them to people from other walks of life, other races, other communities, and try to help knit together the American social fabric a little bit better.
I applaud the work you've done, and I think if we were in Symphony Hall, you would have 1,000 people standing and applauding right now. Thank you so much, Sheryl WuDunn and Nicholas Kristof. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Thank you, Brian.
Brian, thank you. Thank you, Mass Humanities, for making this possible. And thank you, Nicholas and Sheryl. This was a great program. Appreciate it so much, and some great points. For the public forum, the next thing that's coming up, we're looking to do a post-election event, and then we have Ambassador Susan Rice on December 2nd. So I hope everybody will come back. Thank you for such a great night, really successful, and appreciate all the great conversation.
Thank you.